welcome Siriana to this series of authors talk. And although it's been quite soon, quite a little time after the publication of your second book or your latest book before this new one, you came up with another treasure, the Prenatal Shadow, Healing the Traumas Experienced Before and at Birth earlier this year. So, was the inspiration for this new book of yours?
Well, actually, my previous book, The Spirit and Form, which you know very well,
Yeah.
uh, I think it was the final chapter was about shadow, pre and perinatal experience as shadow. And while I was writing it, I got inspired. I have a lot I could say about this. This could be a book. So that was the beginning of the book. And um, so it evolved from there. And, basically, I I think the larger inspiration is seeing how prenatal and birth experience just doesn't generally in our modern Western world doesn't get acknowledged and so isn't reflected. And so it doesn't have a chance to come into consciousness. Um, so it becomes unconscious shadow. We can talk more about that. But first of all, thank you for welcoming me. It's nice to be here.
Both pleasure and a lot of interest for this kind of work as well. So, Siriona, right from the beginning, I mean, the book is full of messages, but right from the beginning, you speak about a dream.
Um,
So I would like to bring our attention to this dream and how it weaves with the shadow.
yeah. Well, just to recount briefly. So it's a dream I've never forgotten. It was many years ago, where I was being chased by monsters and I was running down a hallway. And I think that it was like a maze of halls, but I got to the end of this hallway where there was a door at the end and the door was locked. There was nowhere else to go. So I remembered the advice to face your monsters. So I turned around and I saw three cartoon type monsters, like how they're typically done in cartoons. And I invited them to dance. And they were delighted. And we all joined hands. We started dancing together. So, my understanding of shadow, it's like those monsters were part of my personal shadow. And what we need to do is meet them and greet them and befriend them. Those aspects of ourselves. Shadow is aspects of this is according to um, Carl Jung's disc, definition, which what I was basing the term on, is it refers to aspects of ourselves that haven't been accepted, aren't accepted, or we perceive as not accepted. So we push them back. We try to pretend we don't have them. And often we forget that we have them. So then they go into the unconscious, the dark shadows of the unconscious. And from there, they're always trying to get our attention. They chase us like the monsters in my dream. They want our attention for healing. They want to be integrated. And so they tend to act out, without our consciousness, without our conscious intention, and get us into trouble often. Um, so we probably all have at least one monster inside of us. We're supposed to be nice, good, especially women, I'm supposed to be a good girl, right? But, of course, I have a monster inside me, maybe a few. And, um, I wasn't allowed to express that or to have that or acknowledge that. So my monster really wanted my attention. And, I think part of that for me was, and then part of befriending my monsters was learning to befriend my anger and accept, of course, I have
Mm.
anger, that's totally normal. And that
Mm.
actually is acceptable, even if it's not culturally acceptable, or my parents didn't accept it. So,
Yeah. So, Sheriana, before you go on speaking more about the concept of the shadow as you present it in this book, um, in your dream, you invite the monster, the three monsters, to dance. And is it connected with your dance background? Your
sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I used to be quite fanatically involved with international folk dance. And it was like that, we joined hands like a little circle and we were dancing around. So, it's something very dear to my heart. And it's also something, as I think about something very inclusive, like anybody can come and do circle dances,
yeah,
I used to teach that as well. So, it was natural to invite my monsters to do that. Plus, I love dancing. So it turns out they did too. They just
yeah.
wanted to be included.
So what I keep thinking is that the invitation is was not, as you present it, was not to something superficial or okay, let's do it. It was an invitation from your part to something which is to participate to something very essential, very dear to you.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think
yeah.
dance and movement is part of my essence. So yeah, interesting reflection. And I think I talk a bit in the book about how um, I looked at prenatal and birth themes in dance and movement in my doctoral dissertation. And my the people on my committee pointed out that movement is involved in everything. So I basically had to look at everything. So that included mythology and, you know, traditional dances, the history of dance. And it's not, people today tend to look at dance as just entertainment,
Mm.
but back then it was much more than that. And in the sacred goddess cultures, the sacred feminine cultures, dance was a way of reenacting our life energy and how it comes into form, cosmogenesis, if you will. It's quite profound. So,
Yeah,
it can be lighthearted, but it wasn't a superficial invitation at all.
yeah. So let's go back to the shadow concept. Um, how you uh, came to explore the various aspects of the prenatal shadow. And what do you mean by saying prenatal shadow?
Well, first of all, I feel like I should give credit to William Emerson, who I studied with quite intensively, and he introduced me to the concept of pre and perinatal shadow, and
Mm.
took a whole uh, training or seminar, something with him about that, where we examined our pre and perinatal shadows and how we could identify them. Um, what I look at in the book is how little ones in the womb and around the time of birth are very sentient beings. They're aware. They don't have the same kind of consciousness that we have now. They're not able to talk about things verbally, obviously. Their brain might not even be developed yet, but they're having experiences. And for the most part, that's not acknowledged in our modern world. So little ones can be having an experience and there's nobody communicating with them. There's nobody listening to them. There's nobody paying any attention to them. and nobody considering that their actions around, let's say, the pregnant woman could have a profound effect on the baby, right? But they do. And we know that from pre and perinatal therapy and stories toddlers tell and artwork and dreams and all kinds of things. Um, so, so that's my concept of pre and perinatal shadow, that these important events that happened back then um, go into shadow. And we can see how that happens, how it becomes shadow, because often children, as they're learning to talk about their experience in the womb or at birth, or they do artwork depicting it. And it's usually, I think these days, parents are starting to be more open and to listen and try and understand. But certainly when you and I were growing up, that was not common. And, not all parents do that now. So it's quite different from the example I give in the book. If a child goes to the zoo and the next day they draw a picture of the elephant and shows it proudly to their mother, and the mother says, "Oh, that's the elephant we saw yesterday at the zoo with its big ears. And remember, we also saw the giraffe with its long neck," right? So she's reflecting, she's acknowledging that memory is real, that really happened, and she's helping the child to have words to put it in at a time when their brain is developing that capacity, right? But if they do a piece of artwork about their time in the womb, it's quite unlikely, even with parents who are really curious, they're not that likely to understand what it is, to recognize it, because they're not aware that the child would have had experiences in the womb. And so they don't reflect it the same way. They may not have words for it themselves, because it's not spoken about very much. So the child doesn't get the reflection, doesn't get the words. And instead, I think in our time, it wouldn't be unlikely for them to get something like, um, "What nonsense, you know? Why don't you draw an elephant?" Or, I think these days still it's probably common to say, "Oh, that's a pretty picture. Let's go play with this," distract the child, right? So that's quite a different message. The child gets, "Oh, this isn't something we talk about. This isn't something real or valuable. Um, this is not something to even remember." And so they often do forget, partly because it's not being reinforced. When we have an experience and we want to tell a story about an important experience, that's just natural. And when we tell the story, our memory of it gets reinforced. But if we're not able to tell the story, if we're not able to put it into words, it doesn't get integrated into our conscious verbal mind. So then it goes into shadow.
Mm. So actually, shadows are unheard, unwitnessed, uninvited, unnoticed aspects that matter.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good. I
Mm,
feel sad hearing you say that. It's, they want to be noticed and
mm,
seen and welcomed, which is what babies need.
mm, right. So, however, you say that not all shadow, no, that shadow is not all bad,
Right.
which nicely connects with this little talk we have started to pro, uh, to do now. So, what uh, do you mean by saying that shadow is not all bad?
How could I say such a thing? Because
You
the
say
belief,
such things.
yeah,
Yes, you
yeah,
do.
I do. Because the belief is that shadow is bad. It's unacceptable, so it must be bad.
Yeah.
And I give the example in the book, and then I'll say some more about it. Um, because it just strikes me so often of young girls, a young girl who's really smart, and she does really well in school. And then she hits adolescence, and what her peers think of her becomes more important than anything else. And it's not cool to be smart, it's cool to look good, right? So she starts putting more energy into her makeup and her clothes and all that. And her grades start to suffer, so that she can be cool. And that can be a conscious choice in the beginning. But if that persists, she might forget that she's smart and her intelligence goes into shadow. Most of us would think intelligence is a good thing, right? That's a good quality to have. So that's an example. The biggest example that I like to talk about is what I call our original embryological potential, which is the incredible potential. I talk about this a lot in the spirited form, but the incredible potential that I see the embryo as having, for example, starting as a little unicellular organism when the sperm and egg come together as a zygote, which is relatively simple in form, and it develops these complex bodies. That's incredible potential. Like, how does it know how to do that? And then it goes through various developmental milestones. We all go through various developmental milestones before birth, right? We're used to thinking of ones after birth, like learning how to crawl and to walk and to talk and all that. But a lot happens before birth. And each of those milestones presents a challenge. That's how we develop every step along the way throughout life, is by meeting challenges that require us to develop in some way. And if we are here talking about this, which we are, we have had something in us that knew how to do that. And that's part of that potential that I see. An incredible intelligence, biointelligence, as my dear mentor, Emily Conrad, would call it, um, that knows how to navigate these challenges. Right? And that potential is still there. We might have forgotten that it's there. We might identify with how overwhelming the challenge felt, because often those challenges are life and death matters before we're born. Um, but we can come back to that potential. And uh, what we discover is that potential can include being, let my body do this, being fluid beings. Think about the embryo, it's made up even more than we are of fluid. Right? It's resilient enough to meet those challenges. It's constantly changing. Right? So there's a flexibility there. It
Mm.
also knows a lot about love. A little embryo has a huge heart.
Mm.
And, when you meet a newborn baby, they just exude love, like they know about love. That might
Mm.
get forgotten and put into shadow if it's not met, but it's there. That's part of our potential. And little ones are incredibly relational. Even right at the beginning, sperm and egg have to communicate with each other, or they won't find each other. They send messages to each other and receive those messages. Communication, relationship happens from the get-go. And every cell is in relationship with the cells around it. Right. And the baby is in relationship with the mother and with her external world via the mother. So they're incredibly relational. So they're all really useful qualities that is part of our potential. And if they're not, um, again, if they're not met, if they're not welcomed, if they're not nurtured, they can go into shadow. If
Mm.
the challenges are too great, those that our potential can go into shadow. We identify with whatever we needed to do to meet the challenges. I think that's true throughout life. If we meet a particularly overwhelming trauma,
Mm.
it's difficult to remember who we truly are.
You have used the three times so far, twice forget and one remember. The same meaning to remember, has to remember, which makes me connect shadow and forgetting our original authentic self, or the connection between getting into the shadow, or the shadow appears when whatever values or other information or priorities in the environment are considered as important for survival. You correct me, of course, Sheriona. Then we forget, we go away from our intelligence, as in the example of the girl, to pursue other things like physical appearance or being liked by the peers, and then we forget about something so significant, which, again, to go back to this sadness mentioned earlier, this authentic material goes in the background, and the background, and sadly leaves the ground for other players on the stage.
Mm. Yeah, I'm just reminded of Gabor Mate talks about
Gabor
how
Mate, yeah.
we have needs for authenticity. I forget what the other one is, but I think it's connection.
Mm,
Uh, that children need to be their authentic selves, but in order to survive, they need the connection, the acceptance, the love from their parents, right?
mm,
And those don't always go together. Often they don't. So,
yeah.
parents can really reject the authentic child. And the child's survival depends on the parents uh, welcoming them and accepting them and protecting them. And that's true from the very beginning. That's true in the womb as well. Okay, so little ones in the womb can sense what's being accepted in the world around their mother. They can
Mm,
sense when their mother's being authentic or not. So let's say the mother has had to shut down her authenticity. The
mm,
little one learns, like, oh, it's not safe to be authentic. It might not be as simple as that, but uh,
yeah.
I think it does work that way. So yeah, authenticity can go into shadow, and we can
Yeah.
remember it. With
Yes.
help.
Yeah, that's what Aristotle used it to say, and the ancient Greek philosophers, that we know who we are, we know everything. We just needed to remember, recollect, reconnect, remember the parts, the members to be put together again.
Yeah.
Mm,
Well, shadow work is about integrating our shadow parts.
yeah.
Integration means wholeness, right? So they're not all separate parts, but they are actually in communication with each other and integrated, accepted, welcomed, able to
In
function together.
In your book, you mention this Dagara of West Africa rituals of welcoming the new arrivals. And what Malidoma Somé used to uh, propose and to do when she worked with pregnant couples some months before the arrival of the birth of a child, when they were gathered and they asked the baby using the voice and the body of the mother. So different from what we do now in baby shower rituals, which are again rituals, but so different in the spirit. Would you like to say a few things about that?
Yeah, well, actually, I was at a ritual like the traditional African one years ago when I was in my somatic dance movement psychotherapy master's program. We were, a group, there were maybe about 20 of us in the class, and we were very close because we were doing all this, intense therapy work together. And it was a very intense program. And one of the guys in the class, his partner, they were pregnant and they considered us their village.
Mm.
So I don't remember how they got the name, but they taught us the child's name. It was not his everyday name, but their like spirit name that they had received somehow. I can't remember how. Similar to how they would in tribes in Africa or other places. And based on a tradition they had encountered that I think was an African tradition, when the baby was a year old, they gathered us together. I remember forming a big circle on the lawn outside the school. And they taught us a song, the baby's song, with his name. And it was kind of a call and response song. And they were, holding the baby in the center of the circle. It was so beautiful. I'll never forget it. And that child, I did meet him when he must have been about 20 when I met him. He seemed like he knew who he was.
Mm.
And yeah, modern rituals aren't like that. We have modern rituals. Like you say, we have things like baptisms and um, um, what's it called when they bring gifts for a baby? Um,
Baby showers.
Baby showers, yeah, thank you. Which isn't really for the baby, but um, and on the other end of life, we have funerals or celebrations of life, and throughout life, we have things like um, a graduation ceremony. That's a ritual for each transition. That's like a birth. You know, we have rituals, but compared to, I think what traditional cultures had, our rituals are very shallow, and we're not aware of the meaning of them, and they're not embodied the way they were in those cultures, where people again would be dancing. They'd be dancing and singing, full bodied, fully involved, right? Or they'd go through initiation rites where they had to do things that were challenging for their body, right? Um, and welcoming the baby, again, it was like the whole community coming together to, after whoever it was, it's different in different tribes, who would receive the message of the baby's name or the baby's purpose, which I think is what Malidoma talked about, that he was, to be a teacher all over the world. Um,
Mm.
so they received something about the baby, and then it was taught to the village, so that everybody could support the child in that. And I think in those villages also, the Malidoma, I studied a little bit with Malidoma, and I remember him talking about how, I think he talks about this in his book also, but how he knew who his parents were, but it's like the whole village was taking care of him. So whichever family he happened to be with, when it was dinner time, he'd have his meal with them, or wherever he happened to be at bedtime, he'd sleep there. Um,
Mm.
they all knew him and they all supported him and protected him. Right? Very different from what we have in our modern Western world.
Which also makes us think that it is about a different attitude. Because when you invite a pregnant mother to ask questions to the unborn child, then you ask a question: is there someone, a consciousness, or a being, a sentient being there? And if yes, then it's an invitation for honoring this other present
Yeah.
in the company. So it's a completely different attitude than in comparison to just waiting until the baby is born or growing up and then okay, we can listen to this baby or look after their needs. I don't mean the physical needs or the basic needs, but the more identity, relational, and other needs.
Yeah. Babies in the womb are very capable of communicating, even before conception. This is their communications from the spirit, um, reported many times by parents who it's like they see, um, often it's the the child in toddler form before the conception, and, and the child might even convince them to have them. And
Mhm.
then, a couple of years later, when their child is a toddler, they go, "Oh, that's what I saw," right?
Mm.
Um, so they're very capable of communicating. Listen, we have to listen, and listening involves an assumption, an understanding that there is a sentient being there once they're there, right? Often little children are aware of somebody being there before the parents are. They'll talk to them, they'll
Mm.
communicate with them, they listen to them, they know who they are, they know if they're a boy or a girl long before the ultrasound or whatever it is. you know. Um, but yeah, in our modern world, there's rarely any acknowledgement that there's a sentient being in there. And I think mothers do talk to their babies, but they don't necessarily talk to them as if they're an intelligent being, right?
Why
Um,
do you think they do that?
well, I think it's in shadow. The intelligence of babies is in shadow. And that's in the book, I talk about not just personal shadow, like each of us has our own shadow, but there's collective shadow, there's cultural shadow, ancestral shadow. There's a lot of different layers of shadow. And in our modern Western world, which has been taken over really by a masculine approach, and I don't mean male versus female necessarily, but a masculine approach, which relates to the left side of the brain, which is very analytical, it can separate out the parts and, um, describe each part. It's very verbal and, linear. So that's taken over our world, our modern world. And so anything that can't be dissected and measured and analyzed isn't real, right?
Mm.
So, um, scientists, psychologists were trying to measure memory according to verbal memory, what could be said, what could be heard, um, which is totally inappropriate for a prenate. They obviously aren't communicating that way, you know. And gradually, it was actually in the 90s when I was working on my PhD, I started to find research was developing in that area where they were adapting research methods to make it, um, more appropriate for younger and younger children. So children who weren't really talking yet, they would do things like, um, bring maybe a 6-month-old baby to the lab where there'd be various toys and things. And then they'd have them come back a year later. And they'd take note of which toys the baby was attracted to. And became clear that they remembered certain things, they were attracted to what had been there before, right? So that's more appropriate for a pre-verbal child or a child that's just starting to talk. I don't think they've really reached the stage yet of really acknowledging that little ones in the womb are also having experiences and communicating and capable of remembering. That's in the field of pre and perinatal psychology, we're doing that. But in general, psychologists don't necessarily do that. But part of the collective shadow is also seen in psychology, where, um, well, you edited a book, 100 Years of Pre and Perinatal Psychology, right? And so that's marked, I believe, from when Freud, Freudian times, when his favorite student, Otto Rank, wrote a book, The Trauma of Birth. And that was what, 1924, I think it was.
1920. Uh, it was first publication was 1920, and
In
then
German, right?
there were more publications later.
Yeah.
Until even now, we have more
Yeah.
new.
But
Yeah,
but the reason, so it didn't get published in English until several years later.
mm,
And so Freud initially thought this was, an incredibly important document. He was really happy with it. But
yeah,
he was living in Victorian Vienna, and he was having patients come, female patients, who were describing incest and sexual abuse. And he was working with them. But people objected to that. He didn't talk about those things in Victorian Vienna. Barely, we're only just starting to really talk about them now in our modern world, with these modern times. Um, and so he changed his theory to say that that was fantasy. But if that was fantasy, surely prenatal and birth memories must also be fantasy, right? So prenatal and birth experience went into shadow in the field of psychoanalysis. And it's been coming out because it's so present, it's often seen in therapy by people who are, willing to see it. And, there are quite a few therapists who wrote about it afterwards. But it was not very long ago. I spoke with a psychoanalyst and about this. She was absolutely shocked that there had ever been anything mentioned about prenatal or birth trauma in the field of psychology. This was, maybe 3 years ago. That's cultural shadow. Okay? It's still in action. And in the book, I could associate that with the feminine being in shadow. So again, that's not necessarily women, though it gets projected. Okay, it affects women. um, that it's in shadow affects women, the way they're treated. But the feminine relates more to the right side of the brain, which is more intuitive. It's relational. It's looking at the relationship between the parts rather than trying to divide them up and create competition, which happens when the masculine takes over. It's looking at how to have relationship and harmony. And you know what women do. We hold it all together. Wholeness. We can multitask. We can hold the whole, right? That's a feminine quality. And so the feminine has been relegated to the shadows as the masculine has dominated. And prenatal and birth experience are part of the feminine. They happen in a feminine body. Fertility is a feminine, well, both male and female are involved in it, but it happens in the female body, right? It's a feminine process, right? And it's also got a feminine quality to it of receptivity. It's not about doing. The feminine also involves deep listening,
Mhm.
being rather than doing. And isn't that what little ones need? They need to be listened to, right? At birth and before and forever throughout our lives. We all need that.
Yeah. Well, classical Freudian psychoanalysis was criticized for being very paternal, while Outrank and the colleagues, Ferenczi, for example, Mott, and the rest, who were the founders of prenatal psychology, actually, they are seen as founding the pillars for maternal psychology in the meaning of the qualities of the feminine that they bring to the way we look at the others in our environment and ourselves.
Thank goodness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting. And at the same time, huge, Shariana, because uh, you can uh, perhaps meet a number of individuals and do something in psychotherapy for um, reconciling the two parts or the missing parts. But culture, history, the collective shadow, it takes a lot of work and on so many levels to do something in the right direction. And when I say right, I mean in bringing the two together in a nice dance.
It's a nice way to put it. Yeah. Well, I wrote my book in hopes
Yeah,
that it will contribute to that. And I think it's part of our time. It's time for a book like this, which I see my mission as shining light on the pre and perinatal shadow to increase awareness about it. So it doesn't have to be in shadow. But I think the feminine is also coming out of shadow more. And just to come back to the issue of incest, you know, um, it not only couldn't be spoken about in Victorian times, couldn't be spoken about when we were children. Um, when I did some healing around that myself and came across the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. I don't know if you've heard about them. Um, that was formed by a group of professionals, mostly like people like dentists and lawyers and whatever, who had been accused, usually by their daughters, of sexual abuse and were trying to defend themselves and claiming that, it was impossible to remember something from that time. And they were putting down people like Bessel van de Kolk, who wasn't very well known at the time, um, and Judith Herman, who was also, a big pioneer in the field of trauma, saying, it was nonsense what they were doing. These guys didn't know anything about trauma, but they were a voice of the accepted culture, right, of the mainstream. And before that, so um, I also was trained as an occupational therapist in the 70s. And our training included, half of our training was on mental health, or psychiatry as we called it back then. And probably about a third of it was on pediatrics. And there was never, ever any mention of incest or sexual abuse. Okay. 20 years later, when I was working on my master's um, in somatic dance movement psychotherapy, I decided to do an internship with an occupational therapist with developmentally delayed children up to age 3. And I was really shocked when the OT mentioned to me about a little girl that we were working with who had sensory defensiveness. And she told me that this little girl had experienced incest. And so first of all, I was surprised she was actually saying it because in my day, people didn't talk about that, right? Um, but then she went on to say that she had seen that in quite a few cases, right? And so to me, that was coming out of shadow, right? Now, these days, I mean, you still couldn't talk about it, really. But these days, I think it's very different. I think children are told that, they shouldn't let people do these things to them. And if they're worried about something, here's a number they can call, at least in a lot of places. And there's the whole Me Too movement, like it's coming out of shadow.
Mm.
And the way, well, colonialism and the way white people mostly have treated people of color,
Mm.
and indigenous people, it's coming out of shadow. Still has a long ways to go, but it's gradually coming out, right? So I think it's also time for prenatal and birth experience to come out of shadow.
Mm. I hear you say that. I think of the, the dawn, the early morning hours when a little of light is scattering the deep darkness. Yeah, but the morning sun is gonna come out in a couple of hours after that. So I I have this image in my mind as I listen to you, and I would like to bring our attention. You're speaking about in your book, you speak about shadow and trauma being, or trauma being another synonym for the shadow that you mention in the book. Can you talk a little bit how you connect? Because trauma is what the experience that disrupts the continuity of life or of development. So, can you speak a little bit about this too in terms of common minute?
So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Are you
Uh,
asking about pre and perinatal trauma?
your shadow, the shadow in general, and the trauma as trauma is more widely used now in literature,
Huh.
and the discontinuity of the human potentiality.
So yeah, when our pre and perinatal trauma experience isn't recognized, goes into shadow. So then it's acted out. And ways it can be acted out are um, can be huge. um, so, I come back to the work of Lloyd DeMose, who coined the term psychohistory and looked at how history expresses psychology.
Mm.
And one of the things he talked about was um, wars and how, as uh, people were moving towards a war, you would see cartoons like in the newspapers. The cartoons often had to do with attacking a mother, that kind of thing, and or some big round thing, like a breast or a, a womb or whatever. Um, and so what he saw was that men conducting war, it's usually men, um, are actually expressing their anger towards their mother in the womb, where they got toxicity in the womb instead of what they needed. Okay. So that's a huge shadow, a traumatic shadow being acted out and creating trauma in the world, the larger world, right? And yeah, when we've had traumatic experiences that aren't acknowledged, we can't integrate them. So we can't, as you say, we can't be our authentic selves. We can't be in our wholeness. We always have to be in some way protecting what we're not willing or able to look at, which feels too dangerous to look at, right?
Mm.
So that can get projected out onto other people. So, like my monster, if I saw you as a monster, for example, I don't.
Yeah.
Um, so then you become somebody to fight or somebody to be afraid of, or instead of being able to just be in relationship. And, I see our part of our potential as human beings is to be able to be relational, be in harmony, be creative together, be in our social engagement nervous system where
Mm.
we can co-create. And trauma stops us from doing that, where our whole system is so focused on the trauma.
Mm.
It keeps us from being creative. It keeps us from uh, being open to what's new, what's unfamiliar. It's too frightening, right? I don't know if I'm speaking to your question.
Yeah, Shariona, thank you very much for adding this to our conversation. And let's go back to the beginning. You uh, started inviting the monsters, the shadow, to a beautiful dance, embracing that. And then you speak about the original embryological potentiality that can be still in the shadow, or can trace our biological potentiality there. Uh, is there anything we can do so that we strengthen the dawn light in our life?
Yes, there's hope. That's the question I hear. There is hope. Um, well, read my book might be a start,
Yes,
to
yes.
um, start acknowledging the possibility that, you know, any of us had
Mhm.
experience that might be affecting us from before we can consciously remember, from before we were born or around the time we were born. So, first of all, acknowledging. So, awareness is the first step in healing. And if we're not aware of something, we're not going to make any effort to heal it. So,
Yes.
yeah, that's why I wrote the book, developing awareness. Once we have some awareness, then there's other things we can do. One is we can practice listening. We can do shadow work,
Mm.
pay attention to our dreams, do artwork, and be curious about what it's representing, or writing, kind of spontaneous writing, see what comes out, writing with the non-dominant hand, see what comes out. Um, you know, you can get creative with it. Like, what if your prenatal self could write you a letter or draw a picture for you? See what comes out. So give it a chance to express itself.
Mm.
Um, and be curious, right? And um, also, of course, dance and movement. Um, I learned a lot about mine and other people's prenatal experience through authentic movement, which is a form of spontaneous movement work, like listening to your body, just allowing it to move while being witnessed by someone. And that was actually originally developed by Mary Whitehouse, who was a Jungian psychotherapist as well as a dancer. So it was um, a form of what Jung called active imagination, which was a way for the unconscious, the shadow, to express itself in creative ways. So just paying attention, but um, having a witness is really helpful. And that could be like in an authentic movement group or some kind of movement. There's other kinds of movement groups these days. Um, Therapy can be really helpful with a therapist who's knowledgeable about these things, um, or at least someone who is open to it and not going to be judging you for remembering what happened before you were born. You know,
Yeah.
there are lots of therapists aren't open to that, don't understand it. So, part of my hope is that um, therapists can learn about this work. I think you and I we both have a common goal there. And that also educators and people working with birth and with children and with babies and prenatal and fertility, um, that all of them can become educated about this. And
Mm,
then part of my hope is that we don't have to keep recreating the trauma, you know. So also another important aspect is that if parents or somebody is planning to have a child, that they do their own work around this first, if possible, and resolve as much of their own pre and perinatal trauma as possible um, before even conceiving the child. That
mm,
ideally is part of preparing the ground for receiving a child, so they don't have to just come into the field of ancestral trauma or their parents' trauma. And by the way, resolving trauma, I was having a discussion about this with someone recently, doesn't mean the trauma goes away. Like it happened, but our relationship with it changes so
mm,
that we don't have to be run by it. And that's when it's come out of shadow. If we're aware of it and we have a friendly relationship with it, like me and my monsters,
mm,
they don't have to run the show. They're not going to be running the show. They might be contributing. Maybe they have something useful to contribute, or maybe they have something to learn.
mm.
But we can become more integrated. All of our parts can come together, our aspects can come together. We can be more whole and more authentic and more present and more welcoming to the children coming in.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Yona, for the beautiful book you have written. And looking forward to your next book. Perhaps Prenatal Light? Just hoping that. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you for all your good work too.